Hi class, welcome to part 2 of this unit, and that is the Revolutionary War. We'll be looking at events of the war itself, kind of how the battles went and eventually led to the colonists being victorious, but also a little bit on internally how various people of the region were affected. So as we left off, you'll see 1775 is when we start considering the early battles to have begin. That's before the Declaration of Independence, and they're outside of Boston at Lexington and Concord. At Lexington and Concord, as you know, or have heard of, or maybe have read about Paul Revere or other things, the English troops that went out to do some enforcement of laws, especially of gathering of arms, the Minutemen in various towns came together, as they had been, by the way, especially since 1774, and they are able to defeat the fairly small British troops that were sent out there. And so the colonists then progressed to surround Boston, the city, where the main English troops were. And at Bunker Hill in 1775, a battle ensues there. Again, this is all before 1776. However, after the Declaration of Independence, and since war had commenced, the British Navy, Army, and Parliament decided to leave Boston and go to New York City, which was a major important port and also had a large amount of loyalists from the point of view of Parliament and the officers. So, in fall of 1776, at various places around what we now would all call New York City, battles commenced. In these battles, the British forces were quite victorious. For a number of battles, we don't say how many, but there's more than a few. The Continental Army under Washington just can't deal with them, and they lose and lose and lose. So from December to January, then, after losing, and as the English starts moving down from New York City towards Philadelphia, the next big city, right? So Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were the three largest cities in colonial America. They left Boston; it's too hot there, but they captured New York City, and they're on their way to Philadelphia. But at Trenton and Princeton, here right after Christmas and around New Year's, the colonial troops are victorious. And so, looking back, Washington lost a lot of the battles around New York, but by having minor victories at Trenton and Princeton, he at least prevented a total collapse of the American armed forces. Now, north of New England and New York City, then in that area, by the way, pretty early into the war, that area will be secure for the colonists. So I'll have a map to kind of help show you what we've shown so far in the north. If you look at the red arrows going in and around New York City, in the kind of the middle there, Brooklyn Heights, August 1776, that's where the initial red, there should be more than the amount of stars they have there, but that's okay. And then lower down to the left, you can see there are a couple of blue stars. So that's where they kind of stall them. And that's where this famous, while we're back, up in the north, the next year, up at Saratoga, I hope you can see that, 1777, the colonists will be victorious, and the threat from the north won't ever come back during the war. The stuff over in the West New York and down on what you can see is kind of Ohio and Indiana, we'll come to later. So, this is a famous painting made later of Washington's troops crossing the Delaware, one of those quick victories. But even after those quick victories, at Brandywine and other battles, the British forces are once again victorious. They're more professional, they're better equipped, and there's a lot of them. So it's the second year into the war, 77, that Washington decides to not take on the English forces directly anymore, to engage them sparingly and to kind of outlast them in a way. The British soldiers typically had better housing than the Continental Army, and that's because they had Philadelphia. So, cool example, some of the cool outfits. But again, getting back, this should start to make more sense. We're seeing it for the second time. The Red Arrow shows up at New York. They win a number of victories in and around New York City, including Brooklyn Heights. Then you can see low or down to the left at Princeton and Trenton. There's a few colonial victories. This is in 77, December 26, 76, and January 3rd, 77. And then down at Germantown and Brandywine in 77, again, the British are successfully moving and taking Philadelphia. And that's kind of where we leave off the first years of the war. Again, looking north of New England and New York City, up there at Saratoga in 1777. Again, an important colonial victory. So important that it made the French monarchy believe that the colonists might be able to win the war. And so from this point on, the French crown begins financing the British North Americans, the colonials, against England. That's going to come back to haunt them, by the way. Now, I said I'd come back to this in the Ohio River region and in upstate New York. The Revolutionary War had devastating consequences for the tribes in those areas, especially the Iroquois in New York. The Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee, we're going to talk about this guy, Joseph Brant. They were attempting to stay out of the war. This is a fight between two different people that doesn't concern them, is how they saw it. However, because tribes are entangled in alliances and trade alliances, you'll find important people within the tribe who want to push the policy to go one way or the other. And so there was a major meeting in 1777, and Joseph Brant said, "We need to side with the British, otherwise we will die from either side." Cornplanter contradicted him and said, "Wait a minute, war is war, death is death. We should wait and listen to both," right? He didn't want to go into it too quickly. And then the principal men of the Iroquois tribes then decided between the two, and they went different directions. So some of the tribes supported the British, like Joseph Brant wanted. Some supported the American, and some tried to continue to stay neutral. That was the biggest group. And so civil war breaks out within their tribes themselves, and they start joining one side or the other or not, and they become involved in the Revolutionary War. And it really takes a toll on the Iroquois group. So not something you have to memorize, but just so that you know. Then from 77 and through 79, this war, this map follows it, devastates. That's what I want you to get out of it, because there's a civil war going on and a regular imperial war. is very destructive to that region. Okay, so we last left the coastal lines up in the north with the English controlling Philadelphia and New York not controlling New England. And in 1780, then, the leaders of the British forces decide to go to the south. They're going to go win the war in the south. They feel they'll have more loyalist support there, which is somewhat true. And it's also, especially once you get to Virginia and South Carolina, it's very rich. So you'll be able to economically kind of go to war there. And if you look to the map, before we show you, so I'll tell you some of the stories on the paintings. They land in Charleston, which surrendered. This was not the first time they had tried to take Charleston, but this time they took it. And then, as you see, they move inland into the south. And if you just look at the colors of the victors, there's some blue ones, or there's some red ones. You kind of follow them through South Carolina and North Carolina, and then 1 year later, you follow them up to Virginia, to Yorktown, where they will lose. And that's the end of the war. They will lose enough that no longer will British government want to fight its own subjects and will allow them to go. By the way, the victory up at Yorktown will strongly be supported by French forces. You can see Lafayette's name in blue. They're leading French armies, and Decroix is leading a portion of the French Navy. So this final victory that, what I guess we'll start to call the United States, wins at the end of Revolutionary War is because we had French support. The French were able to make us win, or at least greatly assist. Okay, so going back down to the entry point of Charleston and then inland, that was the plan, remember, to get help. However, the war began to break down into what you might refer to as guerrilla warfare. It was not fought the same way the battles had been fought for previous years up north. And this was in the American or colonials' favor. They knew the territory better, and because they did not have as skilled, drilled, and well-funded armies, they could use an inferior army and make it work by hitting the English troops when the colonials wanted to, and not in open battlefield. It's also famous because the killing of people who had surrendered began to be practiced by both sides. It's known as Tarleton's Quarter. Tarleton, evidently, a quarter would be to give, to allow people to surrender and be prisoners of war. And he ordered his troops to go ahead and just dispatch of them, to kill them. American troops did this as well. It's not really easy to tell which went first, but it seems that Tarleton's breaking the rules of war and prisoners seems to be first. Again, just looking down south, you can see that the Southern armies arrive, and they move all around, win some, lose some, but as they go up to Virginia and Yorktown in 1781, they will lose. Okay, so here's someone's drawing of the event of Yorktown. You can see the brown ocean on the right with the ships, especially French ships, and Washington, Lafayette, and the French Navy are able to surround the British forces, and they surrender. So here's a painting of the surrender there at Yorktown. One thing the British did in the South was offer freedom to African American slaves if they would fight for the English forces. And so there were a number of African Americans who fought for the English. This is one of the passes that someone who's doing that would have to allow their freedom of movement. For those interested, there are at least 12 to 24 women who signed up and fought the war as men, and until they were found out, usually because they were injured and needed some sort of medical attention. So there's Deborah Sampson is the one drawn here. So the war is over in 1781, and in 1783 there is a peace treaty signed in Versailles in Paris, in the Hall of Mirrors and all that, and the United States, according to the world of nations that are in the Atlantic world, the United States is an independent country. Now, in the readings in Chapter 6, it points out that there is, in the former colonies, a great potential for a democracy built on the idea of consent of the governed and voting to flourish. One reason is because there is a broader group of society who owns property. That's a very unusual trait for a society in the 1770s and 1780s. Also, because it's emerging not in medieval Europe, but by displacing native tribes in the 16 and 1700s, the crown had already made it so there would not be an aristocracy. There's no count this, duke that, noble this, and so there isn't going to be an anti-democratic, powerful group trying to stop democracy in the 1700s. Also, the churches, especially due to that first Great Awakening that you saw, do not dominate politics the way the Catholic Church, for example, would be very strongly entrenched in politics in France at this time, and even later times after the French Revolution. So forces that might get in the way of democracy spreading are weak, and I'm going to kind of hedge my bet on there's a little bit of that, but they're not as overwhelmingly strong as they are in other places. The concept that all men are created equal, the floor is freedom is as level as water, these ideas had been circulating among the powerful groups, the politically powerful groups in the colonies, and there was some level of optimism that a new society based on ideas of the Enlightenment, with freedom and liberty, could come forth. Now, there were potential limits compared to our perspective today, and that is gender, race, and class. Okay. So what happened once 1776 was going on and the Revolutionary War? Well, we're going to look at one state, Pennsylvania. It's in Pennsylvania. Excuse me here. Got allergies. Where the most radical group comes from, which is ironic because the Loyalists were strong in Pennsylvania. They eventually lost power to the independent group, which is Thomas Paine and some of these others that you see here. And this group in Pennsylvania was the most radical in its vision of what the new government should be. It got rid of, for example, property qualifications. Okay, you could have $0 to your wealth name and still be able to participate. This was fairly new. It's on the radical side, getting towards more and more of a democracy. They did make a state constitution. It wouldn't even have a governor, so they're trying to get rid of an executive that would be too strong. There's no property required to participate in the vote. The state will run low-fee schools, right? I mean, yeah. So there won't ever be a free school, not even in the public education of today. This is being paid for by the citizens. This is kind of what they're doing then. And they include in the Constitution plenty of written guarantees for individuals to have civil liberties. So this is Pennsylvania. On the other side is, again, ironically, Massachusetts. Got it. Adams, who will be president, is writing, and he envisions something that is more what he would call balanced governments. He wants to see some elements of democracy and plenty of elements where the higher-ups have greater control. Democracy to him and to, when we get to the Constitution, is not necessarily the greatest system. They want to kind of have anti or counter-democratic mechanisms. And this is kind of what he means by a balanced government. It should have some monarchy, some aristocracy, and some democracy. So he would, and Massachusetts would have two-chamber legislatures. And this, again, is an attempt to slow down in case one of the legislatures gets out of hand and crazy, there's another one to stop it. And as you can see, 10 other states follow. So you have Pennsylvania and one other state kind of in their direction, and then most states have this. And in Massachusetts, it was even more strongly away from democracy because they gave the governor a veto power too. So that's what they're creating in most of the states, is a partially democratic system. And right. So when we say partially democratic, I can kind of hear some questions emerging. So for example, you'll have one chamber that let's say property men can vote in, but then you'll have a higher chamber where only the wealthy men vote for. So that's why we say it is, has a lot of that's not democratic if only 2% of the men are participating and control one of the two chambers in the legislature. That's what we mean by less democratic, undemocratic, or counter-democratic. So this is just a cartoon that is not happy with the systems that are going to have some undemocratic elements. So, yeah. So there was definitely an idea that the vote should be for the men. The reason they would think that is they imagined that all properties, all units, all family units were families with a man and a woman as adults and then kids. And so the man would be representing the whole family. That's how they saw it. And so with that, the vote should be fairly broad, because you need to be able to have the vote so that you can defend your right to life, liberty, and property, right? If governments today or back then are creating systems that keep you from voting, then that doesn't allow you and your vote to protect yourself. And so that's what they're saying. And at the same time, those who are more like Adams, who are championing order over democracy, they see that we need to have, if we're going to have that type of voting, then we need to have some elements of government that are less democratic than that, because the more you put into, the more property you have, the more you're putting into the system through taxation. So you should have a greater say in the government and how it operates. Okay, on the ideas, we'll do this quickly. For religious toleration, what you find in the 1770s is the beginning of a separation between church and state, more than it existed before, and a greater amount of tolerance, public tolerance, for diverse religions coexisting. Yeah, that's okay. Let's move on. The Loyalists did suffer during the Revolutionary War. Plenty of property destruction, theft, of their livestock and other items, and they're supposed to be paid after 1783 treaty, but a lot of that was never paid. They did migrate most of them to what we now call Canada. Okay, slavery and the Revolution. Okay, so from 1775 on, you will find various African Americans, and in this case, they are usually not slaves, like Phyllis Wheatley down there on the lower left, who are riding the wave of freedom and say, hey, if this freedom is as great as you all say and is important, it should be for all of us, shouldn't it? And so you see African Americans, especially those who are free in the North, trying to push the boundaries of what is liberty, what is freedom, who has it, to broaden it. Now, in the Revolution, the word slavery was often used as a counter term to liberty, and so slavery is seen as a problem that should be avoided. Yet, ironically, some of the major players in the American political system were large slave owners. And so this kind of exposes John Locke. John Locke, his arguments, part of them would be that a government cannot interfere with a person's property. And so here we have humans being held as property, but also being recognized as humans. So it started to get a little confusing on that. So, but freedom, definitely as the antagonist to slavery, developed, and this is where how much liberty and freedom is the American Revolution creating becomes a complicated matter for historians. And we'll get to the U.S. Constitution next, and that's going to become even more problematic than this period we're talking about now. All right. During the Revolution, you are now experts. That comes from a different class, so ignore that. But you are reading this portion of the chapter, and what you'll find is that there are men and women who call for gender equality in politics, that women should be participating the same way men are. However, most of the men and most of the women in the United States of America oppose this. They argue that gender inequality is natural. Politics is a male thing. So trying to get women to be involved in politics is trying to undo God's specific tasks that he has laid out for men and women in different ways. One way they kind of massaged this a bit was they developed the concept of Republican motherhood. So the way they argued, the majority, the way that adult women participate in democracy is not voting, it's not running for office. It's in fact being a Republican mother. And what this means, as you can see by the picture, especially down below, is as a mother, they will raise up the children to be a word they called virtuous. You need virtue for a republic to function properly. So this woman here, idealistically, would raise the son to her left, our right, giving him all the traits needed so that the country would function correctly. And that's how she would participate in politics. What about her daughter to her right, our left? Well, she would teach the daughter how to become a Republican mother, who will then teach her son how to have virtue and be a republic, and teach her daughters how to be Republican mothers. So you can see how that would function. So this is not an exhaustive account of what was in your readings, but is an attempt to give you the large, bigger picture and see how the Revolutionary War unfolded, how the colonists do eventually win at Yorktown in 1781, and how during the Revolutionary War, politics and how states were organized and how democratic or not they were, it can be seen by you. And then here at the last part, how on one hand there was this electric feeling of moving towards greater equality, freedom, freedom for all, countered with arguments, slaves are not free, men and women are naturally different, and some of the other issues we saw reading here in this unit. Right, good luck.